Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I'm Matt Schultz with the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance. We need data to assess the water quality of our lakes, rivers, and streams and how they are being fed nutrients from the surrounding landscape. Water quality monitoring stations have been set up across the country by various government agencies to collect these data. But is that network sufficient? To find out, we talked to Dr. Natalie Nelson, an associate professor at North Carolina State University. Her team has published a recent article that argues for the need for more monitoring, especially in agriculturally intensive areas of the country.
Well, thanks, Natalie, for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. It's a very timely paper given all the budget cuts that are happening right now and the needs for resources that you're pointing out here. So thanks for joining us. Can you start by telling us a little bit about the paper and the collaborators and your funding source?
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me to speak with you today. I'll first share who the co-authors were. So here we have Christopher Oates and Hector Fajardo. They're the first two authors on this paper. They're both PhD students here at NC State University. And this article that I'm presenting on, it's part analysis, part perspective. So it also has a bit of an editorial in it, which is different than most traditional scientific publications. And Chris and Hector had led the analysis portion. So Chris had compiled all of the data and done the brunt of the analysis, and Hector had produced some important watershed statistics. And then we also have our additional co-authors, Kara Grieger, Dan Obenauer, who are both here at NC State, and Becca Munich, who's based out of University of Arkansas. This work is supported by an NSF-funded center called the Science and Technologies for Phosphorus Sustainability Center.
Great, thanks so much. And yeah, if you want to just go ahead and walk us through some of your slides here, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, so the premise of this study is we were trying to understand, are the nation's water quality observation programs monitoring agricultural watersheds that have intensive nutrient inputs? So across the United States, there's a lot of surface water monitoring that's done by various agencies. So we have monitoring data that are collected by the USGS, for example, the US Geological Survey, and the EPA will fund states to collect monitoring data across their surface waters. And these data can be used for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's to try and identify which waterways might be deemed impaired because of eutrophication, for example. And so in these different monitoring programs, you're going to have people going out to collect surface water samples like what you see on the right here. And so they'll collect a sample of water, bring that sample back to the lab, and then measure different forms of nitrogen and phosphorus in the water. And so there's a lot of variation in terms of how these data are collected across the country. Some areas are more intensively monitored than others, and that's what you see on the map here. So here we're looking at just the continental US, and each of the different points you see, whether they're blue or yellow, is corresponding to a site in a surface waterway where samples are collected for either nitrogen or phosphorus. And in this case, we tried to limit our analysis to only looking at sites that had some level of routine monitoring, so not just a one-off type of sampling event. So all of these sites have at least 40 measurements of either phosphorus or nitrogen that were measured over the span of 10 years. So if you think of 40 measurements over 10 years, that's like approximately quarterly or seasonally data collection. And some of these sites had more than just 40 measurements collected. But what you can see from this map is that there are some places that have really high monitoring effort and other places that have low or non-existent monitoring. And so if we look at just where the stations are located, we found first that surface waters in about 34% of watersheds across the continental US do not monitor for phosphorus or nitrogen. So on this map, you can see some of these irregular shapes. So here, for example, all of these different little irregular shapes are corresponding to individual watersheds. And so about there is 34.5% of these watersheds across the continental US that have no monitoring, and then 18% have monitoring in at least 10 locations within those watersheds. So it's just reflecting how you do have this really wide variation in monitoring. But what we also wanted to understand is, do you have monitoring locations in places where you also have a lot of agricultural activity? So because a dominant source of nitrogen and phosphorus to surface waters is coming from agricultural runoff, we wanted to understand if the monitoring effort that exists across these various programs is matching then the locations where we might expect to have some of the greatest nutrient contributions from agriculture. And so to understand how these locations match up with where we have the greatest agricultural nutrient inputs, we turned to a nutrient inventory that was prepared by Robert Sabo and other collaborators of his. Robert Sabo is based out of the EPA. And so what they had done as part of two different papers, one that was focused on nitrogen, one that was focused on phosphorus, is they compiled a lot of national data and then summarized it at the watershed scale to then estimate what are the contributions or the inputs basically of phosphorus and nitrogen relative to, they looked at a wide range of different input types, but here we focused on just agricultural fertilizer and then manure. So trying to focus in then on those two dominant agricultural nutrient inputs. And so here what we see is on the left, these are the phosphorus inputs, and then on the right, these are the nitrogen inputs. The top row is corresponding to fertilizer inputs, and the bottom row is corresponding to manure inputs. And these are also shown by watershed, like what I had on the prior map. So when you see a darker color, that means that there's greater input of that particular nutrient and input type for that watershed. So for example, here, if we look at the phosphorus inputs from fertilizer, we can see here in the Midwest that you have then much brighter colors indicating greater inputs of fertilizer across those locations. And so Chris had then compiled these data and compared the nutrient inventory data to where the monitoring sites are located to try and understand whether the monitoring locations are effectively capturing these different areas with high nutrient inputs. And so this is one of the main results from the study. Here I'm only showing the results for phosphorus. The nitrogen results were largely in agreement with what we see for phosphorus in terms of how the trends vary across the country. So here I'll just focus on phosphorus, but just know that they're about approximately the same for nitrogen. So this map is a little bit more complicated than the ones that we saw previously. We have, again, here we're looking at the inputs relative to fertilizer and livestock manure, but now the colors on the map are varying based on not only the input, but also what the density of monitoring stations is within a watershed. So here on the right, we have the legend for interpreting this map, and I'll go through basically the four corners of this legend. So first then, here across these different columns, what's varying is how much of the phosphorus input we have. So whether it's for livestock manure or fertilizer. So here, these lighter colors, like in this case, just the lighter purples, these would correspond to situations when you have less of the phosphorus input, so relatively low. And then as it gets darker and more brown and golds, that indicates higher nutrient input.
And Natalie, when you say area normalized phosphorus input, is that normalized by the surface water area or by the area of the landmass?
Area of the land, so it's the watershed area. So basically trying to account for the fact that you would have greater phosphorus mass being input into the watershed if the watershed is larger. So we're just trying to correct for that area effect.
Got it, thank you.
Yeah, and then the different rows here of this legend are corresponding to the monitoring station density. So as you go higher up here, then basically as the colors get lighter, you would have then greater monitoring density, so more surface water monitoring stations. And then as you get to the darker colors, these would correspond to cases where you have, in this case, no monitoring or low monitoring. So across the four corners of this legend, basically here, when you have this purple color, that's corresponding to a case where you have low agricultural inputs. So basically this would be largely areas that are not agricultural. And you also then have zero monitoring stations. So they're basically completely unmonitored for nutrients. Then here, when you have the gray color, this indicates that you have low agricultural nutrient inputs, so less agricultural activity, but it's then also really well monitored, or at least moderately to highly monitored. The gold color corresponds to high nutrient inputs, but also high monitoring. And then the brown corresponds to high nutrient inputs and 0 stations. So this dark brown indicates that there's no monitoring, whereas this more tan color would indicate that you have low monitoring effort. And so taking all of these colors into account, then if we look back at these maps, there are a few takeaways that we can gather. So the first is that about 6 to 7% of all of the watersheds in the continental US have high inputs for at least one agricultural nutrient source and no monitoring. So in this case, we're focused on the dark brown areas of the map. So again, that would be high nutrient inputs, 0 monitoring stations. And so for example, you can see that there are these different parts of the country that have then these brown watersheds. And so those are corresponding to places where we know that there are high nutrient inputs, but the surface waters are not monitored for nutrients. There are also places that have low monitoring relative to their inputs. So these would be places where the monitoring isn't absent, but just relative to the amount of nutrients that are coming into that system through either fertilizer or livestock manure, there's relatively low monitoring effort. So places where we saw relatively low monitoring effort relative to the nutrient inputs included the Mississippi River Basin, California's Central Valley, the inland Northwest, and then also many of the coastal watersheds along the Gulf Coast. So here, for example, you particularly see that with the livestock manure. But it's not all bad news. We can also see from these maps that there are some places that do have high agricultural nutrient inputs, but then they also have high monitoring. So some of these places included the Delmarva Peninsula, so for example here, including parts of Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Also watersheds that are draining to the western Lake Erie basin, also here along Lake Michigan, for example, and then in eastern North Carolina and the Everglades. So here I'm looking at the dark gold watersheds on the map. And one common feature of these areas that we noted is the places that tend to have the high agricultural activity and also high monitoring effort are watersheds that are draining to pretty prominent waterways. So waterways like the Chesapeake Bay, the Albemarle Pamlico Sound, some of the Great Lakes, and in the Everglades you also have then water that's draining down to Florida Bay, for example. So overall, our main takeaways from this article is first that many of the nation's most agriculturally intensive areas, such as the Midwest, have relatively low surface water monitoring of nutrients. And approximately 6% of watersheds with high nutrient inputs have no surface water monitoring, at least for nitrogen and phosphorus. We also saw that some agriculturally intensive watersheds are well monitored, and many of these watersheds are draining to prominent waterways. Ultimately, what we find is that increased resources and improved monitoring technologies are likely required to help have more effective nutrient management, particularly in agricultural areas. So with more monitoring data, we would better be able to identify what might be some regions on the landscape that are disproportionately contributing nutrients to downstream waters. We also might be able to have more precise intervention, basically more precise targeting of interventions. And so here I just have our sponsors and the institutions that all of the authors came from.
Great, that's fantastic, Natalie. Thank you for that. Two quick questions for you. One, in terms of the monitoring, do we know that increased monitoring will lead to better water quality outcomes? And, you know, I mean, I've heard the argument made before that we already know what we can do to solve a lot of these problems. So it would be better to spend the resources on having people do those things and support people doing those things than it would be to monitor the water quality. I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of do we know whether increased monitoring leads to then better outcomes, you know, I'm not sure of like a specific study I could point to that might say that,
Yeah.
But at least I think that you have to have an ability to measure what it is that you're trying to manage. And we also know that in these agricultural areas, there's a lot of variability in terms of the practices that are implemented and adopted. And agricultural areas can span really vast land area. And so by having more monitoring, you're better able to precisely estimate which parts of the landscape seem to be having disproportionate contributions to downstream waters. And so I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head. We have them included in the paper. These areas that tend to disproportionately contribute nutrients to downstream waters, they're referred to then as these critical source areas. And there has been a lot of research showing that critical source areas can be surprisingly small. So in many cases, you can have a critical source area that is relatively small compared to the larger watershed, but it's disproportionately contributing nutrients. And so when you have monitoring data, it helps you to better be able to identify those critical source areas. And so I'd argue that even though you could make the claim that you might be able to better spend money by just using it towards interventions and not towards monitoring, I think that the monitoring helps to ensure that the investment you're making is well justified.
Great, yeah. And the last question is, what about groundwater? Is that situation even more under monitored with respect to phosphorus, or?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know, but it would be possible to repeat this analysis for groundwater.
Yeah, yeah, great. Okay, well, thanks so much for taking the time, Natalie. It's a great paper. I really enjoyed reading it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks, bye.